Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on helping create independent learners. My name is Arthur Moore. Thanks to everyone who has joined live or is watching this as a recording. So just before we kick off, just a reminder, if you are watching live, there is the chat function and the Q&A function where you can put your thoughts, ask questions. All of that stuff is available to you. If you are watching as a recording, what I suggest you do is any questions you have, write them down, make a note of them. And if we still haven't covered those by the end of the webinar, you can get in touch with me via LinkedIn and we can happily discuss those thoughts. But write them down. It's a really good way to kind of process those ideas. So what we're going to be thinking about today is helping create independent learners, something that is really important for us in our profession of tuition. Just before we go, very quickly, my name is Arthur Moore. I'm an online maths tutor and have been a full-time tutor since 2021. Before then, I was a secondary maths teacher and have taught in schools across the UK and internationally in a range of schools, state, international, boarding, all through schools. Almost every type of school I have worked in at some point. I run a outfit called Navigator Tutor, which is a platform for helping tutors develop as educators. In 2024, I was the shortlisted for a few tutoring awards individually and also won the Professional Tutor of the Year. That's by an organisation called the Tutors Association. And Navigator Tutor, which is my online training platform for tutors, has been shortlisted for a few years in a row for multiple awards. This year it was shortlisted for 3 awards, including Educational Resource for Tutors. And as I said, I am a full-time tutor. I tutor individual, one-to-one and in group sessions online for a full range of age groups. So that is absolutely what I do the majority of my time. So let's get into today. So we are focusing on how to create independent learners. And our aims for today's session are to explain what we actually mean by that phrase independent work and what it looks like, discuss why it is important, and also show some ways that we can actually bring this into our sessions. So some practical ideas that we can actually do with our students. So just a quote to start with there. So I'll just give you a moment to read that. So thinking is the hardest work there is, which is probably why reason why so few people engage in. That's a quote from Henry Ford of the Ford Motor Group. So the thing is, we're not, as human beings, actually, we're not natural learners. We are naturally curious, but that's slightly different from being a natural learner. And what the brain is actually do is to save us having to think. And we say this because thinking is low and unreliable. The actual process of thinking is quite unreliable. And give the space, us as humans, we will avoid it. And that's because effectively what the brain is trying to do is automate processes. So if you think about walking, we've got that as an automated process. We're not actually thinking about it. And that's because the brain doesn't want to waste time and energy on constantly thinking about how to walk. So it automates that process. But we do learn things as human beings. And we like learning things, especially when we get a positive outcome from those learnings. And we're actually very, very good at learning when we actually want to do it. As a tutor, the question here becomes, how can I help my student become independent learners rather than relying on me as the tutor? And consequently, we have to ask ourselves, what is our role as a tutor to help our students get to the place where they don't need our guidance and support? This idea of what can I do in my role to help my students is not a new role. Psychologists have been developing and evaluating the efficiency for techniques for study, techniques for learning, for more than 100 years. And yet, despite all this, the students we work with actually often don't develop effective independent learning techniques. So some of the questions we need to ask ourselves is, why is that not the case? Is it because they're just lazy? Is it because they don't want to? Or is it because they actually lack the skills and processes to understand how to become independent learners? And I like to think it's the third one. It's those skills that they lack rather than them simply not wanting to. For the vast majority of students in our contexts, that's actually not the underlying reason. It's another quote for you to just briefly look through. So we need to teach students how to study. And by study, I don't just mean revision. I mean that independent learning idea. So it's not just studying for an exam, it's the process of learning. But we actually need to teach them how to do this independent learning thing, not just focusing on the content. Now, the content is hugely important in our work. We are delivering content to our students. But if we're just delivering content that they can't process and then can't work with and use by themselves, then we're just giving information that becomes unuseful to them. So we really need to think about how we teach students how to study. And why should we develop these independent techniques? Now, what we need to remember is that being an independent shifts the responsibility from the teacher to the student in the learning process. And we do this because we can create greater awareness of their limitations and the ability to manage them. So that's really important for us as an individual to understand the stuff that we don't yet know and are not confident on, and how we can go about managing those limitations, as we call them here. It increases motivation and confidence in our students. And also, and probably consequently, it shows improved academic performance. And that's been shown in multiple studies. And we know we can teach independence. Sometimes we think, well, we can't actually teach independence, the students rely upon. If you think about almost every practical skill you've learned, riding a bike, swimming, driving a car, at some point you were not independent doing that skill. You had support and practice, and you became more independent. If you've been driving a car for 20 years or 2 years or 30 years, you probably still haven't got your driving instructor sitting next to you, guiding you through it, because you have become an independent. You've made that skill independent. So we know we can do it. It's not an argument about whether we can become independent. It's an argument of how we can give our students the tools to become independent. And let's actually discuss what independent learning actually looks like. Actually, what is it? It's not just the student working by themselves. So me saying, here's a task, you get on with it. That's not what we mean by independent learning. That's just the student working alone at that moment. It is about students becoming effective learners on their own. So it's not just them working through a task alone, it's them having become effective learners by themselves. And that, when we're able to get to that stage, that's when we get all these added benefits. So has anyone got any questions there? Or if you're watching this as a recording, here's a good moment to just take a moment to reflect upon some of the learning, some of the stuff we've discussed here. So I'll give a moment for you to either take some notes, or if you've got any questions, put them in the chat. Okay, so someone's asked a question about how do we actually go about this. That is the form for the rest of today's webinar. So we're going to go into some techniques that we can actually do to do this. But I think a good thing to do is actually explain to the student why we are doing this. So we don't want them purely become reliant upon us as the tutor in this case, because we want these benefits. We want them to have a better awareness of their own understanding of the topic. We obviously want motivation and confidence. And we want the academic performance that comes with those. And some of those might speak to each of my students. So if a student is particularly struggling with a certain topic, I might say, well, if we can focus on how you can become more independent when you're working through this stuff, you'll feel more confident and motivated to do it because you're doing it by yourself. If a student's purely worrying about kind of their exam results, stuff like that, I can come at from that angle. Okay, so let's move on to how we actually use our sessions to create independence. I'm going to go through a few different techniques about how we can actually do this with our students. So if you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A function or discuss them. Or if you're watching this as a recording, make some notes and discuss how it's going. So the first one I want to talk about is modeling reflection. So we spoke about on a previous slide how becoming an independent learner is about understanding your limitations. Limitation, not necessarily being kind of a negative connotation there, but understanding where you are at with this topic. And part of that is being able to reflect upon the work you've just done. And one thing that we need is these techniques need to be modeled for independence to be gained. So we need to model these ideas in order for our student to be able to see how they are used so they can move towards becoming an independent learner. So we need to think about modeling. So when we're reflecting upon our work, we also need to think about how we are actually modeling that to our students. So I'm going to give you some examples of some questions we can use with our students to get them thinking about their example. So the example I'm going to give is we've just gone through a worked example. We've just done an example with our student. And here are some examples of questions we can ask. And what I've said here is explicitly and out loud. So these aren't implied questions. I'm subtly trying to get my students to think about these. I'm actually getting them to think about these. So I'll just give you a moment to read through those questions there. So there's some questions we can ask ourselves after we've completed the process. And as the tutor, I model asking these questions out loud so my student can experience and observe me asking these questions. So maybe also a question I ask myself, how effective was my process here? Is there another way I could have answered this question? Would it have been more effective? And if so, why? What are the key steps in my method that I've just done? Is my answer contextually accurate? Does it make sense? And now I finish, what would I change? Would I change how I've started? I really love this last question. I think it's a really interesting question to get our students thinking about. Now I've actually done this thing, even if I've done it wrong or right, even if I've got it entirely correct, if I went back to the start, would I do something differently? There's loads of layers to that thinking that the student needs to undertake. So I really like that question there. I also like what were my key steps in my method. So not what are the key steps, but asking myself to reflect upon the work that I've done. Actually, what were the key steps here? And note again that all the things I've said here are explicitly and out loud. The thing that we're trying to do here as the expert in the teacher-student dynamic, which I went into more detail in a previous webinar, is that we are modeling the processes that the student needs to eventually be able to undertake independently. And as our students see this process, this reflection, being a standard, a normal, a given part of our process, they're more likely to bring it into their own independent thinking process. So obviously, eventually, we want these questions here to be driven by the student and probably internally them asking themselves. But we have to model that out loud for our student to access. That's how we work. So I'm going to walk through a little example of how I sometimes work with models with students. It feels quite long, but you'll see it's more kind of a mindset change in how to do this. So I clearly and completely model an answer. I do my example, which we as tutors do all the time. I then ask my student to silently reflect on the process that has happened there. Silently reflect. I then model the process of self-reflection out loud by asking and answering the questions, like the ones we just looked at. I then ask the students to reflect on what the similarities and differences were between their own reflections that they did silently and my reflections that I have explicitly made out loud. I can use my questioning techniques now to gain insight into their reflections. So what were the similarities? Why are they similar? What were the differences? Why do you think we did these things differently? I now give the opportunities to the student to ask questions about my reflections. So I've done the same to them. I've asked them questions and I model that by getting them to ask me questions. If my students are struggling with using their own questions, I may move this stage earlier so they get an idea of it. And finally, students again now note what they would do differently attempting the same question. So we've got that whole reflective process, and then we've got the outcome of what they would do differently. Now, this may seem like a long process, but this is where you, as the expert, are constantly doing automatically. You're doing this all the time when you're learning something new or when you're modeling. You're constantly reflecting upon your process. If you consider some subjects, such as like drama and art, these points of reflection and improvement are kind of built into the natural processes. Like we call it, don't we, drafting or practicing or rehearsing. We call it all these ideas. But the key here is we as the tutor need to make these processes clear and obvious to our students. So we need to be explicit in our planning and delivery so our student gets access to this thinking. And again, the idea here is that the student is seeing this process. So over time, they are able to do this independently. Does anyone have any questions there? Someone's just asked me to put that back up. So it's very much a process. It looks like a lot step here, but a lot of the steps are kind of intuitively given. So I do the example, we silently reflect. I reflect out loud. I then ask the students to consider their own reflections and compare them to mine. I question them about it and use discussion. I give them an opportunity to question me about my reflections. And we finish by ending with discussing or noting down or writing what we would do differently given the same question next time. If you think about this in English with some of our longer form writing ones, that question of always, how can I do this better next time, is absolutely important. How can I write it more concisely? How can I use more terminology in it? Am I using the text correctly? We very rarely write an essay and say that's done. No, we draft and draft and draft. The next one I'm going to talk about are brain dumps. I'm a huge fan of brain dumps as a task. What we need to remember here is learning happens when our students think hard. Learning does not happen if our students are not thinking. If we're just doing all the thinking for them and all the processes and they are not cognitively engaged, then there is no learning taking place. We need to be very clear on that. So actually, what is a brain dump? They're all about giving your students opportunities to retrieve information. If you think back to the webinar we did on an introduction to cognitive science, we spoke about the retrieval of information from our long-term memory to our working memory, and how when we go over that, we strengthen those ideas and they're less likely to be forgotten over time. So this is where brain dumps are really useful. This is a method that students can use to retrieve information. Now, brain dumps, they are unstructured, and we don't create them, we don't use them as notes or memory aids going forward. They're not supposed to look pretty and nice and kind of all colorful and stuff like that. That's not really what they're for. If we were to really clearly give them structure, then that would be more kind of a mind map. So a brain dump would look something like this. So this is a brain dump I did with a student where we were working on quadratics. And the brain dump was, let's dump all the information we have about quadratics on the board. That's why it's called a brain dump. Literally dump it down. So you can see here that the student, we've got some good terminology there. We've got a couple of formulas. Sometimes we've just got single words. So we've just got quad means 4 or factorize. Not linked to everything, but we just know factorization might be linked to quadratics. There's arrows going all over the place, linking stuff. If I use this as a memory aid later on, it wouldn't actually be very effective. Now, if I was to do something more of a mind map, and this is one on graphs, you can see there's a lot more structure there. That's a lot more structure than my brain dump. So the brain dump is giving the student an opportunity to just basically remember anything they can about topic and get it down on the page. And that active recall is really, really important. What we're aiming for here is getting the students to recall and process this large amount of information and effectively get it on the page. So it's actually a really good technique. If I go back to the one about quadratics, they've kind of got to go through all their information. Which is the topic they're on quadratics? Which is the stuff that's not on quadratics? And what's the link between those two? Now, key here is we want the students to be writing stuff down without prompts. This is not where we are giving them the answer or even prompting them on the answer. We very much want the student to be thinking hard. It's also really useful for them to see any gaps in their knowledge because it really emphasizes that we haven't quite got this bit of information yet. And we don't use brain dumps in a formative way. We don't grade these. We don't mark these. They are purely about recall. And what's really good about brain dumps is we don't have to use them when they're connected on a certain topic. We don't have to do that. I quite often do these just at the start or end of a session or even mid-session, just on a random topic. Let's just get some information down about this. It's really useful for the student. It's also really useful for me as the tutor to see what they can and can't recall. But what's really important here about the brain dump is it's a process that the student can take away and use by themselves. And it's a really, really effective revision technique. And by doing it in our sessions, I'm explicitly showing my students how to use these. I'm giving them methods so they can study effectively. And just to emphasize, again, this is about the student thinking hard. So we don't do it with notes and resources because we want them to be doing this recall of information. And it's that word recall that's really important here. If we are just giving them loads of their notes and they can go through their sections and we're not going to think hard, then the whole process in itself becomes meaningless. Just becomes about them taking notes on things. The whole point of a brain dump is it is an unstructured task without prompts. Again, if we go back to the example I gave here, there's stuff missing from here, which is really useful for me as the tutor to know. I can see that they've maybe got the word factorize, but they haven't linked that here to the brackets here. So that maybe tells me something. They know sometimes it's to do with solve or in the form. Do they know what those terms mean? I'm not entirely sure. They've got something here written dots. Now, dots is a method. It's a very specific method for factorizing a certain type of quadratic. Now, I'm not sure here that the student knows what dots is. They may have just recalled that dots is a thing that I've said or their teacher has said in a session. So there's loads of useful information here. And the student will also be able to see these gaps after we recall these topics. So you could do a brain dump before, and this links to a question someone's like, how can I use these for revision? Sometimes what we can do is we can do a brain dump before we do a revision task and then afterwards, and we can compare the difference. And the student will see, oh, look, by doing some active recall of this, I've remembered certain things. Does anyone have any other questions about brain dumps? There's a couple of questions I just answered there about how to potentially use them. Someone said, what do I do with them afterwards? If you're working in person, there's no need to keep them. There's no need to keep them. I would actually recommend that we don't keep them. We get rid of them. Now, online, again, we can just get rid of them. Sometimes we can save them. They're a bit easier to save, aren't they, if we're working online? And we can use them at a later date to be like, look how much more information you can recall. But I wouldn't really worry too much about that stage of this, because the whole point is we really want is just the unstructured recall nature of that. To have, hopefully that's answered some of your questions. So I now want to talk about one of my favorite areas, metacognitive talk. Metacognitive talk. So I just want you to give a moment to think about that word metacognitive and talk, and just take a moment to reflect about what maybe they mean for you. So before I go into metacognitive talk, I just want to talk about metacognition. Now, when we talk about metacognition, the classic answer is just thinking about thinking. I don't really like that example of metacognition because it doesn't really break down, like thinking about thinking, what does that even mean? How Bradley Bush puts it is that metacognition is the ability to critically analyze your own thoughts, one's thoughts. And we've talked about this when we were talking about reflection. So it's not just being aware of your thoughts or thinking about your thoughts, it's actually analyzing those thoughts and think about how we can use it. And this is where an idea of metacognitive talk comes in. So it's building the idea of metacognition, but using it explicitly for talk. Now, there's 3 stages to metacognitive talk. And a lot of this comes from Vygotsky's 1978, really influential work. It's been adapted, and you'll see this may be used with slightly different words each time. But I'm going to talk about these in terms of external talk, self-talk, and individual talk. The 3 stages. Now, before I go into each stage, the end goal, what we want is our student self-talking to themselves. I like to think about this as kind of like an internal monologue. We want that monologue running. If you think about your student in the exam, you want them having this kind of critical thinking of what they're doing, but it just be that kind of internal monologue. What can I do better? How can I do this better? But actually, that is a very, very difficult skill. It's really hard to individually self-talk really critically to yourself. It's a really difficult skill. And therefore, we break down getting to that skill into 2 other stages. We're going to start with external talk, and then we're just going to go to self-talk. Note the difference between self-talk and individual talk. And I'll go through these. On a really basic level, what the journey is about here is when we're first reflecting on things, we talk out loud. Then we still talk out loud, but really we're talking to ourselves. We're not talking to anyone else. And over time, that process becomes internalized. And I'm sure you can think about this to do with things in your own life. Sometimes when we're doing stuff for the first time, we will talk out loud about it. We will very clearly talk out loud. And then you might go to just muttering yourself through, I need to do this, then I need to do this. We get to the point where we have just internalized that talk. So external talk first is really important. This is something that we can do in our tutoring very clearly. And we are doing that because we want to create the independent internal talk of our students, but we are helping them get to that stage. So external talk is very much how it sounds. We want to be talking out loud about a topic. We want to be talking out loud about it. So we are externalizing all our thoughts. So this is not an explanation. This is us externalizing all our thoughts about a topic. We are literally saying out loud what we are saying. Now, the real benefit of this is when our student is saying stuff out loud, I can access their thinking. So I have a much better understanding of what they're going through. But also the student themselves will hear themselves talking out loud, and they will start to self-regulate what they are saying. They'll realize, oh, I didn't say that word correctly, or that sentence made no sense. I'm sure you've done this when you read through your own work. Maybe you've done some writing, you want to read it out, you read out loud, wait, that doesn't make sense. But you maybe wouldn't have done that if you hadn't said it out loud. Now we're going to give this a go. It feels really uncomfortable, and I want you to kind of feel the uncomfortable nature of this from the student's perspective. So in a moment, I'm going to mute everyone who is on the call, including myself. If you're live, then if you're watching this recording, then you're utterly fine here. And I want you to try and explain out loud what a brain dump is. So in a moment, I'm going to mute everyone, including myself, and I want you to out loud explain what a brain dump is. I'll just give you another 20 seconds there. Okay, so hopefully what you found by experiencing that is it's quite awkward to explicitly out loud talk yourself through a whole process. And that's for something that we kind of understand, because some of you would have used brain dumps before, or you've linked them to other activities you've used in your class. But this was brand new content, as it often is to our student. It's a really hard process. But I'm sure you picked up on you saying things out loud that you maybe wouldn't have picked up if you were just thinking about it in your head, because you would just regulated your own thoughts much easier, and you don't pick up as many of your mistakes as when you read them out loud. It's like when we do a proofreading, it's a much better thing is to read something out loud rather than just skim reading it on a page. And this external talk stage is something we need to very clearly and explicitly model to our students. So this is what we do when we do examples and models. We are very clearly saying this stuff out loud to our students. It's really important that we are doing that. Okay, so we're going to move on to private talk. So private talk is the bridge between saying something purely out loud, externalizing every single process, externalizing every single process, and just having a complete self-monologue stage. So what private talk is we are still saying stuff out loud, but we are not talking to someone. We're not doing it for anyone else to hear. Can kind of think about it as like kind of muttering along to yourself, oh, I need this. You may find this a lot when you go and do kind of the food shop at the supermarket. Oh, I forgot to get sausages. Oh, I forgot to go and get lettuce. You'll say that stuff out loud because it's more explicit, but you don't go, I have forgotten sausages, everyone. I need to go back and get those. It's something you're just saying out loud to yourself, talking to yourself. We all do it, don't we? We all do it at some stage. Oh, I forgot to do this today. I'll go do that. It's that explicit acknowledgement of something. Now, again, we want our students to practice this with us. So if I was doing an example with my students, I say, right, I've done the example. I want to give you a moment to talk yourself through this. Working online with that student, I could just get them to mute themselves and just kind of talk them through with it. And then when we come back to a class, I can quite openly say to them, right, can you now talk me through it? Because they've had time to kind of talk themselves through the topic. So private talk is when we are still expecting our students to talk out loud about something, but for their own benefit, not for anyone else. And as we work on these processes, we move towards internal talk, where these two stages that we've done become internalized, and the student isn't having to talk out loud because they are thinking in that way. I do this a lot with my math students. I talk about how we need to think mathematically about a task. I'm sure in your subject area you do the same. Oh, you're a historian here. How would a historian think about this question? And what we do by working through these processes is we are helping the students to think about in a cognitive way about their own thoughts on a topic. And that's really useful as they move forward. Now, something like this metacognitive talk is a quite difficult and challenging to bring into your tutoring. It takes time because we need to get our students comfortable in a place where they can talk out loud to themselves with us also there. Now, I do this sometimes by allowing them to mute themselves while they're doing that bit and then coming back and sharing their thoughts. That's one really effective way. Sometimes I will set it as kind of a task in between sessions. I want you to practice talking yourself through this, and I want you to talk through it. But the key is I have modeled this through my external talk in the session. So the student doesn't think it's weird to self-talk internally or privately about their own reflective questions because I have been externalizing this the whole session. So for them to ask themselves, oh, what did I do well in this question? Doesn't feel strange or unfamiliar because I have been doing it the whole time. I really like metacognitive self-talk. It's a really powerful method to get to your students, but it does take some time to get to. So there's just some methods we've talked about for creating independent learners. I'm just wondering if anyone has any questions about metacognitive talk there. Someone's just asked, what do I do if a student doesn't want to do this? So that will be a pushback at the start quite often. So firstly, I would be explaining to the student why I'm doing this. So I would be saying this. I'm not doing this because I always want to hear you talking out loud to me. I'm doing this because I want you to get to the stage where you are internalizing this talk. But I would explain to them it's really hard to do that. So it's something we need to practice. Like we do with anything in our subject area, we have to practice this stuff. So I'd be very clear with my students about that. And also I put a real emphasis on them seeing me do it. If they see me do it, it becomes a much more normalized idea in our learning environment that you're creating. So model, 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 and explain why you're doing it. So helping students become more independent is, I would argue, one of the ultimate goals of education. We want students to be able to do stuff by themselves, but we need to be very clear that it is not a I do, you do scenario. That's not how it works. I can't just do something and expect my student to now become an independent learner. I have to break down those stages and give them processes. So we spoke about the modeled example. We spoke about some things that I can do to model my own reflectiveness. So I'd be very clear in using these questions. I'll be very clear in going through this process here and be really clear to the student that this is something we are expected to do. I will model brain dumps and do them in class. We'll get used to doing them. And I will model my own metacognitive talk. I will make that very clear to the student. And if I do these things, the things that the student are maybe hesitant about doing don't feel so weird because I'm modeling it for them. It's part of what we do. To learn, we need to be able to do this stuff. So that's why my key takeaways are very much explain why you are doing something. I'm doing this because we want our ultimate goal to be. So I'm not getting you to talk out loud to yourself because that's what I want you always to be doing. I'm getting you to do it because eventually I want that talk to be in your head. So you're regulating it yourself. And model, and very clearly model externally my own independent processes. And one way you'll have to do this as a tutor is you have to be very reflective about the things that you are doing automatically. There will be processes that you are doing automatically as an independent learner that your student is not aware of. So externalize the things you take for granted. I'm doing this because. Why am I doing this? I'll tell you why I'm doing this. So I'm just going to give you a moment to think about this question here. I just want you to take a moment to think about a small change you can make to your next tutoring session that will help your students access the behaviors of an independent learner, i.e. yourself. So just ask yourself, what can you do to give your students a better opportunity to access your thinking as the expert, as the independent learner? I'll just give you a moment to reflect upon those thoughts. If you're watching this on a recording, this is a really nice point to pause the session and make some notes about stuff you can do for your session. So feel free to press pause and go away and really think about this. Now, a lot of the ideas we spoke about today are to do with metacognition. So if you want to go away and learn more about this, there's a fantastic book called the Metacognition Handbook by Jennifer Webb, which is all about a practical guide for teachers. I would recommend that as a really good book. And if you want to find out more about me and come and ask me some questions, LinkedIn is the best place. So come to LinkedIn, scan me there, come find me and ask me any follow-up questions. I also have a podcast called Tutoring Tips, where around 50 tutors have listened to a podcast. Where 50 tutors have shared a tip about their own teaching and share that as a podcast. I have a WhatsApp community where every week we talk about a different idea in pedagogy. And if you want to learn more about Navigator Tutor, you can do so there. But the main one I would say is come and find me on LinkedIn, connect with me, ask me a question, ask me about your subject area. It'd be great to kind of engage with that discussion. But these are the two things I would leave you with today. Explain why you are doing something and modeling it externally, and keep asking yourself, what are these small changes you can make to help your students access the behaviors of an independent learner? So thank you to everyone who joined the live today and answer some questions. I'll hang around after this and answer any other questions you may have. Thanks to everyone who watches the recording. Please do come and find me and ask me some follow-up questions. It's been brilliant working with you all today. Thank you so much for joining, and I will see you next time.